Chapter 22 of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. The Love Story of Miss Johnstone, Journalist. In the first corner, facing the entrance door of the city room, sat the city editor of the Daily Bugle, his desk piled high with telegrams, proof sheets, and first editions of the rival papers. At the sides and in the middle of the room were arranged other desks, somewhat smaller and less important looking, as became the subordinate positions of the men behind them. Long tables, besplashed with ink, and with blue pencils continually rolling from them to the floor, were surrounded by young men, turning out page after page of manuscripts, and smoking their pipes the while. The office boys were running hither and thither, as the cry of "Copy! Copy!" rang out from different parts of the room, grabbing from the writers a page here and a page there, darting upstairs to the press room, then back again, with hands full of proof sheets, to be distributed over desks and tables. At the farthest corner from the door, where there was an attempt at separation from the rest of the room by a couple of Japanese screens, there were signs of femininity in the shape of a smart fur cape hanging on the wall beside a cheap little looking-glass, depending from a nail by a string. A knobby hat with a green velvet bow and a red feather, a spotted veil in a high heap, a pair of gloves, and a silver-handled umbrella had been thrown carelessly down upon the back part of the roll-top desk. "Miss Johnstone, the city editor wants you quick," called out one of the small boys, stopping on his way to the press room with his hands full of corrected proofs. "All right, Bobby," came the answer from behind the screens, and then the occupant of the exclusive corner could be seen as she rose from behind the high desk. She was what would be called a tailor-made girl, of 22 or possibly 25. The men in the office spoke of her as being "something on looks," meaning thereby that she was not unattractive, that she carried herself well, and dressed in a style that they denominated "smooth." She was not tall, so she wore her hair done high to keep from appearing too insignificant. She had a good figure, so she affected tailor-made gowns, which showed it off. She had not much color in her cheeks, therefore she wore a bright red necktie, knotted in the fashionable mode, which appeared to give a ruddiness to her face. It was not exactly what could be called a sympathetic face. Once it might have been, but now it was rather one that had been schooled to stolidity and concealment by a necessity which knew no sentimental law. Surely not out of the abundance of the heart dared the mouth nor the face of this woman speak. Her long green cloth skirts, with their silky rustle, swept over the floor among the pieces of waste paper, flimsy, and broken lead pencils. "Bobby said you wanted me," she said to the city editor when she had reached his desk. "Oh, yes, I do," he responded without looking up. He was critically examining some typewritten copy, and drawing his blue pencil mercilessly through words, sentences, and sometimes whole pages of it. "Yes, I want you," he repeated as the girl stood waiting. "Hello, Bobby! Here, fire this upstairs and tell them it's to go into the early edition," he called out, throwing the bundle of sheets into the outstretched hands of the boy who hurried towards him. Then the editor continued blue penciling other pages, as he said, still without looking up from his work, "It's not in your line, I know, but I've got to ask you to do a funeral, a lying in state, floral tributes and so on. What with that murder over in the East and being head over ears in political work and that city corruption expose, I haven't a man I can spare for this thing. So do your best with it, will you? And don't try to get anything humorous or even bright and catchy into your account of the affair, as you are wont to do in everything you handle, though of course I've never tried you on funerals." He added this, half bantering, half kindly, as though to let the girl know he was not complaining. John Black, the young politician, Died suddenly last night. He was one of our particular protégés, you might say, so we want to give the poor chap a good send-off, now he's gone. You know of him, of course? Sharp as a whip, but good as gold. Rising young fellow. If he'd lived, he'd been senator, governor, and even president, or I'd missed my guess. Just go to his mother's house this afternoon. Take a train. It's out in the suburbs, and here's the address. About 7 o'clock would be a good time, I should say. There ought to be plenty of floral tributes by that time. Get all the names, you understand, and then—" "Yes, I understand exactly what you want," interrupted the young woman, as though in a hurry to conclude the interview. "And I have no idea that I shall see anything humorous in the situation. If I should happen to, I promise you I shall not put it into the paper." As she said this, she was leaving the editor's desk when he resumed. "Oh, say, Miss Johnstone, will you allow a mere man to make a suggestion to you? Would you mind changing that flaring red necktie for something a little more somber when you go to poor Black's house this afternoon? I've always found it paid for women reporters, and men too, for that matter, to bear in mind these little diplomacies. Look as quiet and unobtrusive as you can when you go. You may run across his mother or some of his relations who will talk for publication." A slight nod and a murmured "Very well" was the answer. Once back at her desk, Miss Johnstone dived deep into her cape pocket for her purse and emptied its contents in front of her. 87 cents, she said to herself. And it's Thursday. I've already drawn $10 on account of this week's salary, and I dare not ask for any more in advance. Money, money, how can I get it? Suddenly she pulled out some copy paper and began to write. "This is the only way," she murmured. "A column for the humorist, and collect on delivery." Page after page passed from under her pen. Then, clipping a dozen sheets together, she read them over, made a correction here, an addition or an omission there, laughed grimly, as though pleased with her work, pushed back her chair, and left the room. The Humorist was a weekly paper, published by the same proprietor as the Daily Bugle, though of course under altogether different editorial management. A number of the regular members of the Bugle staff were among the contributors to the weekly periodical, and were paid for that work at space rates, so that they were thus able to add materially to their weekly salaries. Miss Johnstone was among the funny paper's most valued contributors, and often, when work was slack in the city room of the Bugle, she occupied herself with turning out tales for the delectation of the humorist's readers. A little private arrangement existed between her and the editor, by which she was paid immediately on the delivery of her manuscript, and when she now entered his office with a parcel of paper in her hand, he exclaimed, "What, broke again? Well, let's read your stuff." Throughout the reading, the man smiled the pleased smile of the editor who finds himself in the possession of a scoop that no hated rival has any means of obtaining. "It's great," he exclaimed, when he had finished. "I like it better than any political caricature you've ever done for me. I declare," he went on, with an insinuating grin on his face, "you must have a pull with some garrulous statesman, or you wouldn't be able to get hold of these stories." An order for $10 passed from the editor to Miss Johnstone, who, with a hurried "Thank you, you're a friend in need," left the office. She had donned her hat and cape before leaving her desk, and after stopping at the cashier's office, the doors of the great building swung behind her, and she passed into the street, which was rapidly filling with men and women going to luncheon from the various offices. She was passed by numerous street cars, but neglected to hail them. As she walked rapidly along, her shoulders back, her head erect, a woman whispered to a companion in the crowd, "Look, there goes that Miss Johnstone of the Bugle. They say her salary's something immense. Of all the unsympathetic, cold-looking faces I ever saw, Hers is the worst. I wouldn't be surprised to know that ice water, and never a drop of blood, ran in her veins." Miss Johnstone halted before a florist's window. "I want a wire frame, the kind they use for making wreaths," she said when she had entered the shop. "Now some Jack roses. Give me some buds as well as full-blown roses. No, I don't want any green, except the rose leaves. $8, you say?" She passed over the $10 bill, and taking the $2 change and the parcels of flowers and wire, turned again into the street, then round a corner, then into a lofty red brick building made up of flats. It was a pretty, dainty, feminine-looking room into which the girl entered. Bright draperies, soft cushions, pictures on the walls, easy chairs, books, and magazines, a small piano with specimens of the latest popular music scattered about it, all proclaimed the artistic, well-paid American professional woman. Flower vases filled with roses, such as the girl had just bought from the florist's, were on the tables and the mantel. The room was heated by pipes, after the American fashion, but as she seated herself upon the velvet carpet, with the roses and the wire frame, she shivered, and sharply shut her teeth together to keep them from chattering. Then among the roses deftly flew her fingers, carrying them to the wire frame one by one, till only a circlet of crimson loveliness lay finally in her lap. "Copy! Copy! Proof sheet! Proof sheet!" rang out upon the smoky midnight air of the Daily Bugle office. "Where's that headline I just wrote? Here, take it upstairs and tell them it's to be used with Miss Johnstone's account of John Black's death, which she'll have ready to send up in a few minutes. What's that, Miss Johnstone? Oh, you've got the first 5 pages done already? Good. Here then, Bobby, take the headline and this part of the stuff up together, and say the rest will be done in 10 minutes." Miss Johnstone bent over her desk, writing, her face white, but as immobile and as incomprehensible as ever. "Miss Johnstone, the night editor wants to know if you brought back from the village a photograph of John Black. He thinks we'd better use a picture, even if we have to cut down the write-up to make room for it." One of the copy readers stood at her desk speaking. "What did you say? Oh, a photograph? Yes, I did, or at least I think I brought it away with me. It was a little picture. Go away a minute, so I'll have room to move about and hunt for it among my papers." Miss Johnstone took out her purse, and with trembling fingers felt among the compartments, till she pulled forth a small photograph, evidently cut down to make it go into the purse. It was somewhat soiled, as though from much handling. "Here is the photograph," she said, handing it over to the copy reader. "I have written on the back that it's to be returned to me without fail, as I am responsible for it, and here is the rest of the copy, and I think my day's work is done." She got up slowly, donned her hat and cape, and as she left the desk, a large black Newfoundland dog crawled from under it and followed her from the room. "I never saw that dog before," said one of the men to the night editor. "But he went after her as though he'd belonged to her all his life. He looks like a knowing and valuable animal, and it's queer she never spoke of him, even as she went out." "Speak!" reiterated the night editor, throwing a bundle of flimsy onto the floor. "Miss Johnstone isn't one of the speaking kind. She's been here 4 years, and nobody but myself ever so much as knew she had a family to support." "You don't mean to say she's married?" exclaimed the other editor in surprise. "Married? Certainly not. She's got an invalid mother, a little brother, and a sister about 17 who goes to boarding school, to support, besides herself to keep. How the devil could a girl like that get married if she wanted to?" "Well, her salary and all the extra she makes on the Humorist wouldn't be too much to do all that on," returned the other. "But what puzzles me is where that animal came from, how he got into the office." "Oh, I can enlighten you that much," said the night editor. I saw him come in with her when she came back to do her writing, and he went under the desk and waited till she got through. As they passed my desk I said, 'Fine dog that, is he yours?' And she said, 'Certainly,' with such a fierce look in her eyes that I didn't think I was expected to say anything more." While this conversation was going on, Miss Johnstone was walking home to her flat, the dog at her side. "Here, Comfort, we are home now," she said, as she turned into the lighted entrance to the flat building, and the dog followed her in. A few years ago, a visitor to the little village of , which is a few miles out from one of the largest of our American cities, was looking through the beautiful little cemetery attached to the newly painted wooden church. "Yes," said the old man who tended the graves and kept the grass cut, as he showed the visitor through, "it's as pretty a little cemetery as I ever see, and there's folks buried here as this town not only loved and respected, but as was more than common in intellect. See that there grave over there with the red roses on it? They're ruther faded now, it being the last of the week, but on a Sunday there'll be another bunch bright and fresh. Oh, I could tell ye the tale of them roses." "What tale?" said the visitor, "and who is buried there?" "Well, ye see, we had a young townsman by the name of Black, John Black, to speak by the book, and he war a great orator and politician, and a member of the state legislator. He was brought up amongst us, and he was that anxious after larnin' that he sawed wood in the summer time to get money to pay for schoolin' in the winter, and he got through the state university that way, and supported his old mother into the bargain. He tuck to law and then to politics, and afore he war 30 he'd made a stir, and there warn't nobody that didn't believe he'd be sent to Congress, and after a while get to be president, just as soon as he got old enough. Well, the campaign of 18 , you remember what a tough thing that was over in , of course? John Black took a great interest in that, and he tuck off his coat and went to work to defeat the other fellers, and he made 10 and 12 speeches a day. He rushed first from one meetin' and then to another, and always with his black dog along with him, which war a mighty intelligent beast, and used to set on the platform with Black, and bark fit to kill when his master got through and the folks was a cheerin' him. He tuck great stock in that dog, did Black, and called him by the name of Comfort. Well, poor John Black, he fell down with a stroke of apoplexy, and died just as he was goin' to a meetin' of his party, and that war a hard day for this village, and he had such a funeral and layin' out as a governor might be proud of. Flowers was sent from all over, and delegations from all the big towns came on, and John Black was buried as befitted the great man he was, and the greater man that he could ha' been. O' course, there were lots of reporters from the big papers sent down to write about the funeral, and as we afterwards larned, there war a young woman reporter from the Daily Bugle, a paper that set great stock by John Black, and him by it too, that went to the house and made a particular request to go into the front room alone where the corpse was, as she said she could do her work better if she war alone, and she wanted to write down names and make a picture of all the flowers or somethin'. They let her do as she liked, and besides, the rest of the reporters hadn't begun to come yet, and she was in the room something about 3/4 of an hour. Late that night they couldn't find the dog nowhere, though John Black's cousin, what let the young woman into the room, said the dog was under the trestle where the coffin was when she went in, and she couldn't get him to go out, and his howlin' was that pitiful when they tried to drag him away, they hadn't the heart to do it. They found a wreath of red roses pushed way down to the foot inside the coffin, and they didn't know how it got there, and some was for taking it out, as red flowers wasn't suitable for the dead, but only white, but nobody seemed to dast take it out, and John Black was buried with 'em on his feet, the same as they was left. Black's mother went out of her head and died in a few days, and after that the story got round, I don't know exactly how, that the young woman reporter from the Daily Bugle was Black's sweetheart, and they was waiting to get some more money afore they could get married, Black having his mother to support, and so they kept the matter quiet. Some of the villagers said they remembered seeing her and John Black going riding in a sleigh in the winter time, and they always tuck the dog along, and another man said he see Black and the gal and the dog eating dinner in a restaurant. "It was the young woman reporter that put the wreath in the coffin and took the dog then?" asked the visitor. "Yes," returned the old grave tender, "but the sorrowful thing, to my mind, is this. They say the young woman she seed Black at her office the very afternoon before he died, and she never knowed a thing about his death till her editor told her to go out and report a funeral, tellin' her John Black had died sudden like, and the editor he didn't know neither that John Black was anything to the young woman, and she was a quiet, close-mouthed sort of woman, so she never so much as cried out when she heard it, and she went and made a wreath and brought it with her, and she wrote up the laying out for her paper, just the same as if her heart wasn't a breakin', and never told nobody at the newspaper office a word about it. The dog, he knowed her, and followed her out of the French winder that opened onto the piazzer, and when Black's cousin went to see if the young woman were through with her writin' and drawin', her and the dog were gone, as I said. It's a couple of years now and more, but every Sunday the young woman comes out to the cemetery with a lot of roses, and puts 'em on the grave, and she brings the dog along of her, and they sits by the grave a while, and then goes away. The village florist, he says the roses is what you call Jack roses, and a kind John Black always bought plenty of every week when he was alive, and carried 'em to the city with him. I s'pose he took 'em to the young woman. I used to think the young woman had a hard face which warn't exactly lovin' when I seen her come on a Sundays, but once, about 10 o'clock at night, I come through the graveyard as a short cut home, and the moon was up, and I see her and the dog settin' by Black's grave. I watched a while, and she put her head down on the grave and clawed at it with her fingers, and then the dog he scratched and whined, and the young woman kep' a sayin', 'Oh, Jack, Jack, if it wasn't for the rest of 'em that I have to look after, I'd come to you with comfort, but I must stay here, Jack, to take care of 'em all.' They say as how she's got a sick mother and other folks to support, and when I see that and heard her a cryin' so pitiful, I knowed how it war. It's what you'd call a sorrowful tale, this here, ain't it?" And the old grave tender went his way. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Story of a Failure. Remember, let no obstacle stand in your way. You are to move heaven and earth to get this information. Don't let anything like trouble, time, or expense be taken into consideration. If you need 10 times the amount of money you have with you, telegraph for it. Put forth every effort. Expend all your energy to make this thing succeed. And if I should fail? Don't think of it. Don't use the word. You must not fail. I've picked you out for this delicate job because it has seemed to me you had in you all the qualities that were needed to bring the thing to pass. You've got diplomacy, tact, shrewdness, discretion, and above all, you are absolutely feminine, and you haven't got newspaper woman and interviewer placarded all over you. I want this information, and I believe the man I am sending you to is the only one who can or will give it, and I believe you are the only person who can get him to give it. Don't you dare to fail. Thus was I sent one day to Washington to penetrate into a secret of state, to get certain most valuable information from a very eminent personage who resided at the nation's capital. It was at a time when the getting of money was a matter of very great importance to me, and I went upon the mission as a sort of freelance. That is, I was to be paid all expenses and have a handsome fee if I succeeded, which it was impressed upon me by the editor that I must do. If I failed, well, I would not get the fee, but I would be allowed what was known as expenses. It was with a large amount of self-confidence that I set out upon that mission. The editor had declared that I had all the elements of success in my own person. Why, then, should I not succeed? Why should not the eminent personage give me the information I sought? Why should I not get hold of a state secret? I had heard that other women, in present days and in days gone by, under monarchical governments, had become possessed of valuable information concerning affairs of state. Now, what those hampered women under monarchical rule could accomplish, should not I, an American woman in free and easy Washington, with its ready access to government buildings and government officials, do? I arrived in Washington, took residence at one of the best hotels, ordered whatever I wanted for comfort and even luxury without having to take expense into consideration, changed my traveling costume for one more smart and fashionable looking, and took a cable car for Capitol Hill. I had learned that at the Capitol I would find the eminent personage. My card bore the name of a London paper, as well as that of the American paper in the interests of which I had gone on the mission, but I drew my pencil across the name of the London paper. It showed quite plainly, however, and the word London looked large and important. In one of the luxurious waiting rooms of the Capitol I waited while a boy hunted up the great man with whom I desired speech. It took 3/4 of an hour to find him, and another half hour before he would come to me. When he finally came, and I saw him, I experienced a feeling of pleasure that the man I had been sent to interview was a gentleman of more than ordinary refinement and culture, for I always hated coming into contact with vulgar, common politicians. This man, who approached me with my card in one hand and holding out the other, was the polished gentleman, with dignified yet pleasant face, of easy yet irreproachable manner. He shook hands with me. "You've been in London, I see," he said, turning to my card. "Yes," I replied, "but, as you see, I have not come from the London paper to you, but from the—" He took one of the upholstered chairs near me. "Of course, you want to interview me, and I have no notion for being interviewed," he said. "But first, before we come to that, I can't help telling you that your name and face are very familiar to me. I seem to know you, and now, where did I know you?" "It must have been in the other world during our previous existence," I laughed. "Perhaps we were great friends in that other existence. Brothers, I shouldn't wonder, for in the other existence I'm sure I was a man, and in punishment for some crime was condemned to be a woman in this." "No, that's not it," exclaimed he, laughing. "Because you see, I don't remember you as a man at all. Oh, I think I know now. Did you not some years ago get an appointment to go to Peru as private secretary to the American minister?" "Yes," I replied. "I remember now," he went on. "You were in Washington just before you left your country. You were doing the Capitol, and somebody pointed you out to me and said, 'There's the little girl that's going to be a diplomat.' I had heard about you, of course, for it was so extraordinary for a young woman to get a place in any of our legations, or any other legation for that matter. I was curious to see what sort of person was going to start us in for female diplomacy. I particularly noticed you, and the whole thing struck me as ludicrous. You seemed very young, very ignorant and innocent looking, and very bright and happy looking too. I vaguely wondered what was going to become of you, whether you would ever come back to your own country again, and whether you would become a woman with a career. How did you make out as a diplomat? Did you penetrate into state secrets, learn all about Peruvian affairs, and serve your country well and nobly?" He sat back in his chair and laughed softly, and I laughed too, but I felt more sad than gay, Because this man's remembrance of me brought back to me the memory of something of happiness and ignorance and youth, which I knew I had left behind me, and then I liked not his reference to state secrets. It annoyed me, because for the moment I had forgotten why I had come to Washington. However, for a few minutes we talked over Peru. I told him, much to his amusement, about the earthquake and the fleas, and we chatted about indifferent subjects till he said, "But you have come to interview me, and I haven't another minute to spare now till dinner time. Since we are such old friends, suppose we dine together this evening, and while dining we will get down to the business of interviewing, which, if not nearly so pleasant to me as chatting about England and Peru, will be, I suppose, more profitable to you. Now, what do you say to 7 o'clock at the restaurant? Till then, good-bye." This easy meeting, easy approach, and this getting upon a footing of such pleasant acquaintanceship, not to say friendship, was something I had not counted upon. It was, I knew, a very advantageous beginning, one that my editor would look upon as a great piece of luck. I felt assured of success as I walked all the way back to my hotel, walked because I wanted to think out the whole interview carefully, and lay all my plans for getting the scoop that was to delight the editor, astonish the public, not only in my own country but in other countries, and bring me in a goodly sum of money. That evening, as I sat opposite the statesman at dinner, our conversation took in many subjects. He was widely traveled, and talked most entertainingly and instructively of all that he had seen. He was interested in certain English affairs which I, because of my late residence in London, could give him information upon. He knew all the embassies and legations of foreign countries, and talked familiarly of the different diplomats accredited to Washington. I asked an occasional question, and suddenly the information I wanted came to me in the most natural, informal way in the world. Not only that, I was told far more than any editor could dare to hope any reporter could discover, and I learned things I had not tried to learn, but valuable things from the newspaper point of view, nevertheless. Both this man and I were interested in the great subject of peace. Peace, not only in our own country, but in all the countries of the world. We talked of the necessity for an international court of arbitration. We deprecated the cruelty that war brought about, the hardness of heart, the deadening of sympathy for human and animal suffering. We shuddered at the thought of horses left wounded and dying in slow agony, untended and lonely on the battlefields. "I am glad to find that our opinions are in perfect accord upon this subject," he said. "For the present I am obliged to keep quiet upon certain matters of my belief. It is policy for me to do so. I would not have talked to you as I have done, if you had been the ordinary newspaper woman. One cannot speak frankly to many representatives of the press. Now, you are a woman of discretion, and I expect you, in writing up your interview with me, to use your own judgment, and, of course, your judgment will tell you what must not go into the paper." He walked with me back to my hotel. "Good night," he said. "Good luck to you, and be careful with your interview. I wouldn't have trusted that innocent little girl that went to Peru as a diplomat with some of the information I have given to you to-night. I am inclined to think you are more of a diplomat now than you were in those days." He laughed again, half sadly. "Remember," he said, "you and I might be the cause of somewhat disturbing peace if we talked too much. Good night again." He was gone, and I took the elevator to my rooms. I turned on all the electric lights and made the place a brilliant blaze. I put my hand dazedly to my head. I looked blankly at the great pads of copy paper supplied by the telegraph office for newspaper correspondence. There was a knock at my door. "Come in," I said. "Telegram," said the boy, thrusting a silver tray out towards me. "Any answer?" he asked, as I read the message. Now, the message was this: "Any news yet? Urge every effort." "Yes, there's an answer," I said to the boy, and on a telegraph form I wrote one word, "Wait," and handed it to him to dispatch to the paper from which the telegram had come. It gained me time, that was all. Then up and down the room, up and down for over 2 hours I walked, fighting such a battle with myself as I had never before been given to fight. I knew that not one single word of what the great man had said to me ought to be put in print. It might do harm to him, harm to the country, harm to another country, harm perhaps to a cause in which we both were interested, the cause of peace. "I must not write it. I must not write it," I said again and again as I continued my journey up and down the room. "I will not let journalistic instinct get the better of my discretion, my honor, my judgment." But there was another side to the question. There was a duty one owed to one's paper, to one's editor. To be sent after a thing, to get it, then to refuse to deliver it up, was not that a sort of theft on my part, a dishonorable act, a trifling with the best interests of my paper and my own best interests as well? Why did not great men keep silence if they did not wish their remarks, their fears, their hopes, their aims to get into the papers? Why had not this man refused to talk with me? Ah! You and I might be the cause of disturbing peace if we talked too much. That was what he had said. Then why had he talked to me, a reporter? But had he said the more important things to a reporter? Had he not rather talked to the woman who was in accord with his sympathies, his views, his aims? When a woman was a newspaper reporter, where was the dividing line between herself as woman and as reporter? Should she govern her womanhood and her honor by her journalistic instinct, or should she govern that journalistic instinct by that honor and that womanhood? Honor? Yes. But what about the duty she owed to her employers? What about withholding that which they would consider theirs by right? And there was the money I was to receive. I am glad to remember that when at first I began to fight that battle, I did not take the large fee I was to have into consideration. Not until I had nearly decided what to do did this phase of the matter occur to me. I needed that money. I had earned it. No, I had not earned it. I had not worked hard to obtain it. The success of my mission was due to an accident. The man had first become interested because he saw by my card that I was from London. Then he remembered having seen me in what now seemed to me that long ago time when I was a 9 days' wonder, going away to a far country as a member of the American legation. He had not cared anything about the paper I represented. He had talked to me personally. We both desired peace. Therefore, he did not expect me to write up anything that might help to bring about war. I went to the telegraph forms, tore off one, and wrote, "Absolutely impossible. Refuses even to see me. Useless to try. E.B." It was past midnight, but I was known to be a newspaper woman, and there was nothing surprising in the fact of my ringing the bell and asking the boy to send this telegraphic message at once. He started down the hall with it. I stepped out, and as I saw him disappearing, I called after him, "Wait a minute." He turned back to come to me, and I said, "No, go on, nothing. Send it off instantly. Don't let anything delay you. Get away with it. Get away with it." I went back to my room. 2 minutes had gone. I rang the bell. The boy was delayed in answering. "That telegram I gave you. Quick, has it been sent? Can't you get it back?" I asked. "No, it's just gone. I saw the telegraph operator tick it off." "All right, it doesn't make any difference," I said. But it did make a difference. What difference I knew not, but I have sometimes since thought it might have made a very important difference, that perhaps it was given unto me at that time to influence certain events which quickly followed. At the instant when I called the boy back, I would have recalled the telegram. When I rang the bell, again I would have recalled it, but I could not, for it was on its way to the editor of the paper. When it was fairly gone, I knew I was safe. I had lied, saying I could not see the man, and I did not intend to confess myself a liar. I laughed over the way I had caught myself in my own snare. I had told a good lie, and I was going to stick to it. I argued that if all was, as they said, fair in love and war, I had a right to say to my belief that some things also were fair in peace. There was lying in war. Indeed, it was often brought about by lies. Why then should not I add my little mite in the way of a lie for the sake of peace? Very early the next morning I wrote a note to the man I had interviewed. After leaving you, I decided it was best not to send anything of our conversation to the paper. You told me to use my own judgment and discretion, and they have warned me that much harm may be done by the repetition of any of the important statements you made. I have telegraphed to the paper that you absolutely refused to see me, because if I said I saw you, I would be required to explain how I had been so stupid as not to make you talk, and I cannot bear to be thought stupid. I am sure that if it should ever become necessary for you to bear me out in my statement that I know not the man, you will do so by insisting that you know not this woman, because for me to be caught in a lie would be almost as embarrassing as for me to be thought stupid. I sent this note by special messenger, and took the first train out of Washington. You mean to say that you, with all your heralded originality of resource, couldn't so much as get a look at that man? Asked the editor, when I had returned from my trip. Yes, I mean to say it. I never failed to see anyone before but Gladstone, so don't be too hard on me. You said if I couldn't get to him, nobody could. I don't know when I swore so hard as I did last night when your telegram came saying you had failed. I felt so sure you would succeed when I got your first telegram of wait, that I had my headlines ready. What did you say wait for? Oh, that was before I entirely gave it up. I was trying to see what I could do. Well, I'm sorry for your sake as well as ours. It would have been worth a pretty sum. But make out your expense account so I can send it in, and I'll add $10 for your trouble. That's the best I can do. I shall pay my own expenses, and I don't want the $10. I got nothing. You owe me nothing. Oh, say, that's nonsense. We always pay the expenses and time rates when you go off on a job like that. Don't you go to doing anything of that sort, and establishing a dangerous precedent for the other poor devils that fail. Your expenses must have been $20, weren't they? Make them out now. But I did not make out any bill of expenses, and I took no time rates on that occasion of failure. The lie I had told rested easy upon my conscience. I did not regret it. I never shall. But I had, in a way, cheated that paper out of something, and I was not going to make it pay for the privilege of being cheated, and I lost $30 by that failure. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Some Proposals and Some Love Letters. My dear young lady, I am reading all your letters to the paper telling how you try to live on $3 a week. Sometimes I dream about your being cold and hungry. You do not say where you are employed at that price, and I suppose you dare not for fear you will lose your place. You must have suffered very much before you was willing to write to the paper all about it and tell what you have to eat and how you have to cook it to make it last. It makes me feel bad that an American woman should have to do that. I hope you will not think I am impudent, but I wish we could keep company together, and if we liked each other, as I think we would, we could get married, and you would have a nice home. I have looked at your picture in the paper, and was very sorry you should have let them put it in. I cannot tell much how you look, and I would like you to get a tintype taken if you could afford it, but I know you cannot, and so I would like to come and see you. Tell me how you look, and if you are light or dark, and how old you are. I am 30, and I make $3 every day at carpentry, and sometimes as high as $3.50, so you see I have plenty of money to support a wife, besides being $400 in the dime savings bank. Will you let me know when I can come and see you, and give me the address, or maybe you would like to meet me at my sister's, who lives in New York. I have to send this to you care of the paper, and I hope they will send it to you. Your sincere friend and admirer, J.T. This was one of the many hundreds of letters of all kinds that came to me while I was engaged on a series of articles in New York entitled, How I Live on $3 a Week. I have already mentioned this experiment in a former chapter. I was making the experiment with the idea of telling New York's working girls how to live as economically as possible, and to discover whether or not a working woman could live, without suffering and privation, on those wages. Before the series began, an explanation of who I was, what I had done in England, and why I now proposed to do this thing in New York, was published in the paper. This issue of the paper, I fancy, did not fall into the hands of the writer of the above letter. He probably began reading the opening chapter, in which I stated that I had $3 a week, and proposed to tell people how I lived upon it. Then, from day to day, there appeared installments of my story from real life, telling what I had for breakfast, for dinner, for supper, how my room was furnished, how I cooked my food over my little oil stove, and every day an artist or photographer from the paper was sent to the room to make pictures of me and it as we progressed. One picture represented me peeling potatoes, another sweeping up my tiny room, another grouped my cooking utensils together, most of which I had bought at a 5-cent store. The series was an interesting and very successful one, and for doing it I received liberal space rates, so that I counted some of the privations I suffered as of small account. Not so the young man who wrote to me from Brooklyn and signed his full name. As I have said, he had not read the introduction to the series, and he did not understand that a woman journalist was making the experiment. He understood that the writer of the sometimes bright, sometimes pathetic tale was really a girl who had only $3 a week to live on, and that she was writing to the papers about it, in order perhaps to gain the sympathy of the public, and, by telling of her own troubles, to help others to bear theirs. And the pathos of it all had touched his big heart. He had dreamed of me, dreamed that I was cold and hungry, and determined, if agreeable to me, and if, after going through that period of courtship known in England as walking out, and in America as keeping company, we loved each other, to marry me. Many another woman journalist would have hunted the man up, posing as the unhappy, ill-paid working girl he imagined her to be, and, perhaps, have got material for another series far more interesting and strikingly sensational than the one that was then appearing. But to me there was something sweet and beautiful and noble in the letter, and I could not use the writer as a subject for a joke. I answered the letter, to be sure. I thought it well that his mind should be eased, that he should not worry over the trouble of an imaginary person, so when the series was finished I wrote to him that my letters to the paper had helped me to get a nice position, where I had $10 a week, out West, and that I was going out there to live with an aunt. This letter was very similar to one I received in London just before I began publishing my experience as a housemaid. It was published at the time, but I here repeat it to show that kind and sympathetic hearts are to be found among the young mechanics of England, as well as those of America. It came in answer to the advertisement I inserted in the Daily Telegraph, for a situation as housemaid, and ran as follows: Dear Miss, seeing your advertisement, I am moved to write and say that I admire your pluck and am glad to know there is at least one young woman with sense enough to see that there is no disgrace in domestic labor. I would like to marry a girl like you, if you are not too old or ugly, which I do not believe you are. Please state age, complexion, height, temperament, and personal appearance, and tell me if you would accept for a husband an honest mechanic, aged 28, and earning £200 a year. If so, give me your address, and I will come and see you with all honorable intentions. It is much better for a girl like you to be married and have a protector than to be a housemaid. But these proposals, like some I got during my masquerade as an American heiress, when, had I possessed the bank account I was imagined to have, there was no reason why I should not have become my lady several times over, were gained under what may be called false pretenses. The young English mechanic desired to marry a housemaid. The young American aspired to the hand of a factory girl who was starving and freezing on $3 a week, and the Englishmen of noble lineage paid their courtly devotions to a supposed Miss Moneybags who had dollars to burn. I take no credit to myself on account of them. They were not intended for me, but for the person I misrepresented myself to be. It was to myself, in my own proper person, in my humble capacity as journalist, that the following highly inflammatory and amorous epistle was addressed. I found it on my desk one morning when I was a yellow journalist in New York. Adored Mademoiselle, I read always what you write in the papers with vivacity, and I watch you sometimes when you go from the door, and see that you are chic. I follow you in the cable car when you do not know, and I walk before your home, up and down, on the sidewalk. I know you not, but I would your friendship be glad to make, when I would love you and have the felicity to hold you in my arms. I am in a strange country, and like not the New York women, only you. I read the paper always, and watch for your name, but you have not traveled enough, and I would take you to my dear France. I am a gentleman and noble, as you see by the card. I have been in diplomatics, but not now. My name you may have heard, for we are very proud. I do implore you, mademoiselle, to let me pay my respects at your residence and tell my adoration. Adieu. Most respectfully, . According to the card enclosed, my admirer was Le Comte, and had at one time served his country as a diplomat. I did not answer the letter, and 2 days later there came another lovelorn epistle along with a large bouquet. I send you the roses, it ran. They are La France and American Beauty. Will you not wear them and let me know that you return my devotion? I will marry with you and take you to France, and you shall be La Belle Americaine. I had no thought to insult you, which you may think. I love you for the vivacity. The roses adorned my desk for many a day, but I wrote not to my would-be wooer until my life became a burden, for a dapper little dark-eyed, mustachioed Frenchman haunted my footsteps, and jumped onto cable and elevated cars after me, on one occasion losing his balance at the Park Place station, and being pushed back violently by the iron gate as it swung to. I knew, of course, that the man who followed me so persistently must be the writer of the letters and the donor of the beautiful flowers, but whenever I saw him I tried to appear as though I did not know it, and put on as unconcerned an air as possible. Once I met him on Fifth Avenue, and he doffed his hat and said, "Ah, mademoiselle, you are too cruel!" And I rushed up a flight of brownstone steps and rang the bell violently, inquiring for some one I knew did not reside there, to get rid of him. But the next day a letter, more violently lover-like than ever, came to me, all scented with heliotrope, and along with it a box of bonbons. I was heartless enough to eat them up, and when I wrote presenting my compliments, and expressing thanks for the honor he doubtless desired to do me, but begging him to cease his attentions, as my heart was otherwise engaged. In reply to this, there came a passionately protesting letter, to which I replied that any further letters he wrote me would be turned over to my editor for insertion in the paper. I never saw nor heard from Lecomte again. I once went to interview a large landowner and wealthy cattleman from the far West. I wanted his opinion on the subject of girls being employed to herd cattle in the West. A very interesting and unique American was this man. He was possibly 40, tall, athletic, tanned brown by the sun. There was no pretense of polish about him, and his speech showed him to be a man of little book learning. He had been a cowboy in his youth, and now he was worth an immense fortune. I had never lived so far west as the state from which he came, and I had never met this manner of man before. He was blunt, bluff, brusque, yet underneath it all there seemed a kindness and respect for women which could not but put me at my ease. "Say," he exclaimed, stretching out his long legs from his chair and pushing back his large, broad-brimmed hat from his face, "do you know that I like you, and I've got a notion that you and I ought to be hitched?" "What?" I exclaimed in amazement. "See here, do you like money? I mean, do you like to spend it on flummeries and silks and such like?" "I certainly do," I answered frankly, "but what of it?" "I thought so. Now you listen to me, and don't you interrupt or get scared, for I've got no idea about you but what's just right. I've been living out west all my life, grubbing away for the stuff, and haven't had time to think about fallin' in love, and of course you needn't think I'm goin' to make love to you, for I've just met you. But I want to make an honorable business proposition to you. I'm not a gentleman, that is, on the outside, because I haven't had time to learn when to bow and scrape and take off my hat and when not to, and don't get around quick enough to pick up a woman's handkercher when she drops it, and things of that sort. You're educated, and I'm not. I didn't have no chance when I was a kid, and as I said, I've been grubbing ever since. I always thought I'd like to have money, and now I've got it. If it ain't $1 million, it's so near it there ain't any use calculating how much less it is. Now, I took a notion to you because you set about your work quiet like to interview me, and I says to myself, here's a hard-workin' girl, she'd make money fly if she had it, and wear satin dresses with ruffles and flutings every day, if she could afford it. She'd appreciate playing a piany, and she'd know how to help a fellow improve and make something of himself. She'd know an honest man when she laid eyes on him, even if he wasn't a dude. My proposition to you is this. Will you marry me, and if we fall in love afterwards, all right, and if we don't, we'll be good friends anyway. I'll treat you on the square. I'm no fool, and I learn things quick enough when I set my mind to it. You could teach me, and I'd be a good scholar. I'm a young man yet. I want to rub myself up now, stop the money grubbing, and be a congressman. Oh, I'd get there right enough if you'd help me. I wouldn't expect you to live on the ranch, not more'n 3 months a year anyway. We'd travel around the country and go see furrin parts. You wouldn't have to do any more work, but just have a good time. I'd be good to you, I would, little woman. What do you say to it?" I caught my breath. I had had many a strange encounter with men in my career as an interviewer. I had thought I had met all kinds and varieties, and that my experience was wide enough to take in every sort. I had met honest men, dishonest ones, gentlemen, boors, men who openly insulted me, men who tried to cover up their insults in the polished phrases of the courtier. Here was a new sort, a man pathetic in his honesty, yet grand and noble of character, the kind of man one would fancy God might make when he put forth every effort to do his best. I shrank from hurting his feelings. I wanted to let him know that I felt he had honored me, and that I did not see anything ridiculous in the situation, that I would not go away and laugh about it. "I thank you more than I can tell you," I said. "You have done me an honor I shall never forget. Don't ever say again you are not a gentleman. You are. Good-bye." I put out my hand. "I suppose it's no go then?" he asked. I smiled. "I believe that would be the short way of expressing it," I said. "Well, I'm glad I spoke to you about it, anyway. I couldn't know until I mentioned it, could I? Say, if you ever come out my way, you just send me a line, and if I'm there, I'll see you don't want for nothing. But I'm goin' traveling, I am. You may hear of me in Congress, or Governor, or something, yet. You wouldn't be sorry then?" "No," I answered, "I wouldn't be sorry then." I left him standing on the rug. A kitten had come into the room while he was talking, and he had stooped and picked it up, allowing it to play with his watch chain. One of nature's noblemen in the rough, I thought him. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. An Editorial Bouquet. It was 4 years ago now since back again to London I came, having finished up my work as yellow journalist. I have already told what good fellows were those members of the different staffs upon which I was employed, helping me over the rough places and making easy many a road that would otherwise have been hard to travel. They were good fellows to the end, up to the hour of my sailing away from my native land. Loud and severe indeed were their comments of disapproval upon what they denominated my determination to be a regular right-down Johnny Bull. And when I was about to take my farewell of the office where I was last employed, they sang out sonorously and in unison a paraphrase of dear old Dinah's Dixie song. "Her heart's turned back to London, and she must go." Nevertheless, to show their good will, and to prevent my forgetting them, as they declared I would surely do, writing for dry, high-toned English papers, they took up a collection of various knick-knacks among themselves, which one of their number brought to the steamer just as it was about to sail. Each member of the staff had contributed something from his own personal effects at the office to such a farewell testimonial for remembrance as I fancy no other woman ever brought with her to London. One contributed his pen, one his brand new pipe, one a band from his straw hat, one a necktie, one his pencil, one a half-used blotting pad. There was a Japanese doll, known as the office baby, an almanac, a paste pot and brush, snatched up from one of the reportorial tables in all its state of much-used stickiness, a jackknife, a pair of scissors, a ball of twine, a box of pins, a box of cigarettes, an empty ink bottle that was far from clear and clean, a flashlight photograph of several members of the staff taken in their shirt sleeves, a French novel, a box of candies, one orange, and a bouquet of flowers. These things were piled in great confusion onto the sofa in my stateroom, and on the top of the miscellaneous heap was a wire spindle, stuck through a paper, on which was written, "You'll miss us when you're gone." Miss them, certainly. Good friends they were. And yet, not to a foreign land, nor to strangers did I return when I came back to London to work for English editors upon English newspapers and magazines. I have sung the praises of my American editors and journalistic co-workers, and shall I not now sing those of the English members of the Fourth Estate, with whom my work has brought me into contact? Most conscientiously and most truly let now this chapter tell of the virtues of London editors I have known and still do know. I keep always upon my desk what I call my editorial bouquet. It is a book containing the names of those English editors that I love best. On the pages devoted to each individual name, I jot down notes of subjects for contributions that I have in mind to offer them. I turn over those pages now as I write this chapter. Ah, here among the first I find the name of him whom I have named my hard-up editor. By this I do not mean that the gentleman in question himself is hard up, for such is not the case. I mean that he has a predilection for stories of hard-uppedness. Whenever I am particularly hard up, I write a story about it and send it to this editor, and he always sends a check back by return of post. He says that he depends upon me to keep him supplied with articles and stories of this description, and I have always been able to let him have as many as he could use. Only once during my several years' connection with his periodical has he been under the necessity of writing to ask me for a contribution. That was when I was writing a book. Which book does not matter. I had not sent him any story for the space of 2 months, when there came a short note from him, saying, "I have not had anything from you for some time now. I take it you are very prosperous these days." I immediately responded with a story of "A Man in Possession," for which I received the next day a check with this injunction, "Get him out." I turn over a page or two and come to the name of one eminent, venerable, highly honored, and widely renowned editor, for whose pages I sometimes contribute. I went to his office one foggy, winter day to consult him upon a most important subject. I have said the day was foggy, but it was not an ordinary fog of the half-light, half-dark variety. It was absolutely thick and absolutely black. I fell over myself several times stumbling up the stairs to the great man's office. When I walked in, the fog had no way dispersed, yet when he rose from the leader he was writing to shake hands with me, he exclaimed, "Ah, the sun has come out." And yet they say that Englishmen are lacking in gallantry and the art of saying pretty things to women. A few more pages, and I see the name of a smart young editor, whose acceptances from me are many, and whose checks are liberal. He would be such a perfect editor were it not for one habit, that of marking up the manuscripts of rejected articles in such a way that I have to write them all over again before submitting them to any other editor. The first article of mine that he rejected he kept for several weeks, finally returning it to me with this note: "You cannot feel as much regret as I do at my finally having to return this article. I like it better than anything of yours I have read, and I tried to make up my mind to use it, but I know it is not in our line, and now, therefore, I am obliged against my will to send it back. I assure you I did intend to use it up to the last minute." Intend to use it! I should say so. Why, the appreciative man had it all paragraphed, newly punctuated, and marked with a blue pencil with such observations as "Excellent," "A little tall," "Doesn't have the ring of truth here," "Write her about this," "Not so good," "Might be improved," "That's it." Now, it happened I did not see any of these pertinent, blue-penciled remarks until my attention was called to them by another editor who helps to make up my editorial bouquet, and to whom I sent the article off, post haste, when it had been returned by the first editor. The second editor wrote me to come and see him, and then held that queer-looking manuscript before my eyes. "Now," said he, "I don't agree with the remarks you have been to the trouble of putting on this manuscript. In the first place, I don't call that particular paragraph excellent, nor do I think that there is anything tall in this statement. Where you have written 'might be improved,' I find your construction altogether blameless, and I rather like the whole article. But now tell the truth about this manuscript. What does it mean?" I saw a twinkle of large suspicion in the second editor's eye, and so, without any hedging, I said, I expect it means it went to another editor before it came to you, and the other editor intended to use it and changed his mind. But I didn't know the marks were in it. The first page was quite clean, and as I thought it was just in your line, I sent it as soon as it was returned." The second editor accepted and published the article. If he had not, he would not have been brought into my editorial bouquet. But that does not make the offense of the first editor any the less serious. He has rejected 3 of my articles after marking them up in the same manner, and I have had to copy them over, as I have informed him. I now make duplicate copies of everything submitted to that particular editor. Again to the book of names I turn, and I see the name of an editor who is always asking me to "try a little fiction" for him. He says he believes I would succeed with fiction, although I have never yet got out of the habit of writing only of things that really happened. For several years this editor has been urging me to "make up" things for his paper, and I have never yet done so, though I am a frequent contributor to his pages. Now, I have mentioned that in the earlier part of my career in London, I purchased a typewriter on the installment plan. Well, as the months went by, I managed with much economy and trouble to get the succeeding installments paid until I got to the last one, and for that installment, which was to make the machine my very own, I could not get the money. The people from whom I bought it waited most considerately for some time after the payment was due, but finally they sent a man to take it away. That was in the days of Dinah and the flat. The man was a very nice sort of person, and truly sympathized with me, I think, when I told him I could not make my living if he took the typewriter away. Nevertheless, he declared that he must obey orders. "It is now," I said, 12 o'clock. Will you go away and let me use the typewriter till 6 o'clock, or even 5? I promise you that you shall then have the machine or the money." "Certainly," he answered, and he left the flat. I sat down and rattled off a story of a young woman who bought a typewriter on the installment plan. She earned her living by doing her work for the newspapers. She could not pay the last installment, therefore she wrote a story about her troubles and took the story to an editor, and he paid her for it on the spot, and so she saved her typewriter. I had my story finished at 2 o'clock, and I carried it to the editor who is always asking me to "try fiction." He was very busy, but I insisted that the story was of a kind that must be read on the spot. He read it. "That is a capital story," he exclaimed when he had finished. "I always knew you could do fiction. I'll send you a check next week for it." "But that will be too late," I said. "The typewriter will be gone then." "What typewriter?" he asked surprisedly. "Why, the typewriter that the story tells about. The man's waiting for the money, and if I don't carry it back to him, he'll take the machine." The editor sat back in his chair, gave me one stare, and then laughed long and heartily. "I don't know if I'd advise you to try fiction after all," he said, and then he took his pen and wrote a check, and I went back and paid off the final installment on the typewriter. Another editor on my list is one I call my serious editor. He is a very busy man, and always in deadly earnest. I went to his office shortly after my return from America. "Where have you been all this time?" he asked. "And what are you going to do for me now? Some really good work you ought to do." "Yes," I answered, taking a seat. "I've been on the music hall stage, but now I shall try to get into high-class drama and play Shakespeare." "What!" he exclaimed, frowning terribly. "You've been on at the halls?" He looked very pained, very serious. He is one of those who have always encouraged me to do better things. "I only meant I have been doing yellow journalism, and now I want to write for your high-class magazine," I answered. "Then why didn't you say so? Why mention the halls? Why frighten your friends?" He is the typically serious Briton, this editor. There is one editor on my list whose great kindness to me at a very trying time in my London career will always be one of my happiest recollections. He had asked me to write on a certain American subject for his periodical, and I had asked him whether on the completion of the article it would be convenient for him to pay me before publication. "Certainly," he said, "I will do it with the greatest pleasure." When I was writing the article, I found the subject a most difficult one to manage. I was to have condemned certain American things, certain American customs. I had not been in England very long at that time, and I found it more hard than I had imagined it would be to criticize with a sharp-pointed pen any institution, however bad, that was a part of my own country. I feared also to offend certain persons in my native land. As a result, the article I wrote was useless for the purpose for which the editor had intended it. It was deplorably weak. I had hedged, and in hedging I had spoiled my article. Yet, when I handed it to the editor, I did not know of these faults. He sent me a check immediately, and then several weeks and a few months went by, and I heard nothing of it, though I knew he had expected to make early use of it. Finally, I wrote asking if anything were the matter with the article, and he asked me to call on him. Was ever a great and distinguished editor so kind to a struggling contributor? "I found it would not do at all," he said, ever so gently. "I wanted something very strong and condemnatory, and you have written a bright article, but you have been afraid to say what you thought. You have hedged terribly. It has seemed as though you were afraid to offend some of your countrymen. Now let us read over some of these pages and see if you don't agree with me." We read it over together. He pointed out the mistakes, the weaknesses, the truly awful hedging. "Yes, I see it all now," I said. "I was afraid, as you say. I was afraid some of the papers in my country would pitch into me and hurt me in some ways. But I shan't mind it now. I'll take the article, now I see the mistakes, and I know I can make it what you want. I'll rewrite and revise it all. You have paid for a certain kind of article, and you have the right to demand it." "I think I will not let you do that, though you offer," he returned, smiling. "I believe the kind of article I want is not the kind of one you ought to write in your present circumstances. You write for some of the American papers. You will not want to gain their enmity by criticizing your own country's institutions. It may do you irreparable injury for this article to be printed. I hope the time will come when you will be independent enough to use your pen for principle for the sake of principle, whether or not it offend certain classes. But the time is not yet. You are not old enough nor advanced far enough in your career to take such a stand. I will not publish the article I so desired, even if you write it for me." I started back in horror. But you have paid for it," I exclaimed. I did not add that I had used the money to pay a very pressing debt, and that I had no means of giving it back to him, but I think he suspected it. He answered, laughingly, "That money is safe, well invested. Never fear. You will one day write for me such an article on this subject as will make us both glad that this one was a failure. I want you to feel that I have paid you that money as one pays a lawyer a retaining fee, to secure myself for the good, strong, non-hedging article you are going to write for me on this subject some time in the future, perhaps within the next 5 or 6 years, when you are in such a position that you can and ought to write it." 3 or 4 years afterwards I wrote the article he desired. I did others on different subjects for him in the meantime, for which I was paid as though I were not largely in his debt. "I now pay you my debt," I wrote to him when I finally felt that I was able to do what he wanted. "Thank you, thank you," he wrote back. I find in reading your manuscript that you have paid me a very good rate of interest on my little loan. Good friends indeed I left in America, and good friends I came back to in England. Would that all struggling, half-discouraged women journalists might fall into the hands of such whole-souled Anglo-American editors as many of those for whom it has been my good fortune to work. Again I turn over some of the pages of the Book of Remembrance on my desk. I can only mention a few of them out of the many. Here is the editor who always writes to me in a hurry. His letters are somewhat like telegrams, so brief and so to the point are they when he sends me an order for a rush contribution. Can you not write me some typical American love letters? I would not wish them to run to more than 4 or 5 pages. Faithfully yours, blank. This was the startling communication that came to me from the editor in a hurry about a year ago. I considered it altogether too terse and abrupt, not to say brutal, even for an editor to write thus on such a subject, even limiting one to the number of pages on which she might express her feelings, so I dispatched the following answer. I'm afraid I cannot. Your request is altogether too sudden. I had no idea that you would desire anything of this sort. Even if I attempted it, I greatly fear I would not suit you, and I certainly would not wish to be limited in this peremptory way. I would advise you to try an English woman who would be more apt to meet your peculiar requirements than an independent American woman. Faithfully yours, blank. Of course, a somewhat more lucid and enlightening epistle followed. It seemed that people of all nations were writing love letters for publication, and he desired to print some samples of American literature of that sort. He added, "Of course, you see, I'm rather pressed for space, but if you can't manage it in 4 or 5 of your typewritten pages, I could grant you a little more perhaps, but do be as brief as possible." Certainly, but, as my serious editor asked in regard to the music halls, why didn't the editor in a hurry say what he meant in the beginning? There are many others. These are but sample blossoms from my editorial bouquet. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. On Interviewing and Some Interviews. It is one of my chief ambitions as a journalist to become a really excellent interviewer. That goal I have not yet reached, but it is one towards which I strive. Interviewing, or doing what in newspaper parlance is known as personal write-ups, is, it seems to me, the most pleasant, interesting, and edifying branch of journalistic work that can be taken up by a woman. It throws her into contact with the great, the extraordinary, and the interesting people of the world. I consider that, other things being equal, women make much better interviewers than men, for the reason that they are usually more tactful, and have, well, yes, I feel that candor compels me to admit it, a far greater amount of adroitness among their natural characteristics. They are also quicker and more apt at observing and taking account of the little things of life, and more capable of making much ado about nothing when they return to their offices after having been in conversation with a prominent personage. If a woman knows herself to have no tact, no adroitness, and has not the talent for turning small and apparently unimportant things into interesting copy, then she should never attempt the personal write-up department of journalism, for she cannot succeed in doing anything but boring her readers. In the days when I was a heroine, a young English woman journalist called to write me up after I had several times been interviewed by other papers. She found me sitting at my typewriter, but not writing, for there were 4 kittens, 3 weeks old, in my lap, whose mother had forsaken them, and I was warming milk for them over a spirit stove, and feeding them with the milk, each in its turn, from an after-dinner coffee spoon. Judge stood beside me, eyeing the proceedings with great interest, and as each kitten was sufficiently fed, he would take it gently from my lap and carry it in his mouth across the room to the sofa, just as he had seen its mother do. "I can't rise and shake hands with you properly," I said laughing, to the young woman as she entered, "because, you see, I'm a woman of family, and I've got domestic duties." The young woman journalist took out a notebook, and when she was seated, asked me where I was born, where I was educated, what I had done in American journalism, and what was my opinion of the woman's movement, all of which things had appeared in the papers dozens of times before. How dry, how altogether uninteresting, were the facts relating to my birth, my education, and even my opinion of the woman's movement, if I had any, which I hadn't, compared with my feeding of the motherless kittens from after-dinner coffee spoons, and Judge's carrying them about in mother cat-like fashion. There was that young woman's story, but she failed to grasp it. Some time later, another Englishwoman journalist came to write me up. She had no notebook, and when I discovered that fact, I made up my mind that she was a good interviewer, for the best interviewers do not carry notebooks. They are the signs of an out-of-date, dry-as-dust journalism. Judge had met her at the door and conducted her to my sitting room. She patted him, inquired his name, and said it was so singular for a dog she could not possibly forget it. We talked on all sorts of subjects. I told her the story of how I had once demanded to be treated like a man on the Southern paper, and some of my experiences in Peru. We had tea together, just like two women friends, and when she was leaving, I said, "Of course, we've been talking informally, but I know you understand what I'd like to have go in print and what I wouldn't." "Oh, yes, it will be all right," she said, "but, if you wish, I could send you a proof of my article." "Never mind about the proof," I answered. "I believe you to be the model interviewer, and I leave myself in your hands." I could not have done better than to have left it all to her judgment. For such a bright, entertaining account of her visit to me, did she write as to confirm my opinion that she was the model interviewer. She had the tact, the adroitness, the art of turning little incidents into entertaining copy, and, being a student of character and human nature, she had "sized me up" most wonderfully well. That was several years ago, and she is now one of the finest interviewers in England. Many are the newspapers and magazines I pick up to find in them her bright little personal sketches of people of the day, and I always know that she can turn even the most uninteresting interviewees into interesting copy. One of the greatest disappointments of my journalistic career has been that I was not able to interview Mr. Gladstone. It was my desire to write a character sketch of him for both an English and an American paper, and one day about 6 years ago I went to Hawarden Castle for that purpose. I carried with me a letter I had previously written, telling him that I was an American, that I desired not to interview him on any particular subject, but only to see him that I might put my visit to him in my journalistic book of remembrance. At Hawarden Castle I sat on a chair in the hall. It was quite near another chair, which, I fancied, had served as tea-table for little Dorothy Drew, for on it was an apple core and a bit of a broken dolly. The servant carried my letter to Mr. Gladstone while I waited in the hall, and he returned presently saying that he had delivered it and that his master would send his reply in a minute or two. My heart beat high with anticipation, for I believed that the grand old man would see me. He could not, I thought, turn away an American woman who had gone so very far to see him. I had waited perhaps 10 minutes, when a carriage drove up to the castle, and there alighted from it a woman, whom, from the portraits I had seen of her, I recognized as Mrs. Gladstone. She had with her a little girl, doubtless Dorothy Drew. When she got into the hall she looked at me in amazement, then came towards me, very near, and observed me again, but she said not a word. She went a few steps and called to a servant. I thought I heard her ask, "Who is that young person?" He made some explanations which I knew referred to me and my motive for calling upon Mr. Gladstone, and she hurriedly went up the stairs. In 2 minutes there came to me the message by the servant, "Mr. Gladstone's compliments, miss, and he regrets he cannot see you." "Was Mrs. Gladstone the lady who passed me just now?" I asked. "Yes, miss," he answered. Had she prevented it? I do not know. I was, I believe, the first woman journalist who interviewed that wily old celestial, Li Hung Chang, and the first woman to whom he talked after he arrived in England. I had heard he was an early riser, so I got up very early one morning to call on him before I had my breakfast. When I asked for him at Lord Lonsdale's residence, they told me I had got there too late, that His Excellency was about to go driving. "Please go and say to His Excellency that an American woman journalist called to see him before she had her breakfast, knowing that he was an early riser, and that she is sorry she got here too late. Tell him that the Americans are also early risers, and that the American woman will call on him tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, and if that is too late, she will call the next day at 6, and if that's still too late, she will come the next morning at 5, but that she must see him." This was the message that gained for me admittance to Li Hung Chang, for in 10 minutes the attendant had returned, saying, "His Excellency will be delighted to see the American lady." He was very nice and polite in his way, was Li Hung Chang, though instead of my being allowed to interview him, he interviewed me. When he asked me my age and my yearly income, I thought he was getting too personal and did not deserve to know the truth, so I added to my income all that I subtracted from my age, and when he demanded to know why I did not get married, I hedged as best I could. He gave me a medallion portrait of himself in a purple morocco jewel box, and told me always to keep it in memory of the old man of China. Notwithstanding all the things the powers credited, or rather discredited him with during the latter days of the Chinese question, how could I feel but kindly towards Li Hung Chang? For from England he went to America, and being interviewed by the representative of a Chicago paper, he referred in a most complimentary way to an American woman who had interviewed him in London, and asked to be introduced to some more just like her. The gold might wear off of that medallion he gave me. Indeed, when I look at it these days, I have sometimes thought it was not quite so shiny as it was the day he gave it. And no matter what happened in China, I have always felt down in my heart a sneaking liking for the wily old man. When I was employed on a New York paper, I went to Lewiston, Maine, to see Mr. Dingley, and tell him what, as an American woman, I thought about his outrageous tariff bill and $100 clause. I took along with me a lot of ribbons and laces that I had bought in London, and some that I had bought in New York, in order to give him an object lesson in the difference of prices in the two countries. I called his attention to the hat I had bought for a guinea in London, and explained that in New York it would have cost $20. I told him how he was the cause of turning honest American women into smugglers. Mr. Dingley was about the most unreasonable and unconvincible man I ever interviewed. I did my best to get him to change his mind on the tariff question, and especially to have repealed the obnoxious $100 clause, but he was smiling adamant. However, I remember him as the most kind, pleasant, and helpful, so far as giving me copy was concerned, and none laughed more heartily than did he when my terrible arraignment of him as the enemy of American womankind appeared in the paper. When he died, 4 years ago, the little In Memoriam I wrote came from my heart. A kind, good man, and the typical American gentleman, was Mr. Dingley of Dingley Tariff fame. I have also the most pleasant recollection of an interview with the late Henry George. "What will you say about me?" he asked laughingly, after we had had a chat during the days when he was running for mayor of New York. "I will say, Mr. George," I replied, "that I have interviewed an honest man, and that man was Henry George." "Ah, thank you. Success to you, my friend," he said as he shook hands. It was but a few days afterward that I was sent to get some of the details of his sudden death, which came just at the end of that hard-fought municipal campaign, and I was very glad I had met him and had been able to write my story of the honest man. One of the pleasantest interviews I have ever had was with Sir Thomas Lipton, a little while before he made his attempt to lift the America Cup. Very chivalrous, very observing, very intent upon making his interviewer enjoy the process as much as he seemed to be enjoying it, did I find the great tea merchant. I went to his place at New Southgate, was met at the station by his carriage, and as I entered his door he shook hands and said, "Let me thank you for the compliment." "Compliment?" I answered. "Which one?" "The wearing of the green," he replied, bowing gallantly. Then I remembered that I was wearing a green dress and a hat with 3 green feathers. "Oh, yes," I returned promptly. "I wore my green clothes purposely, in honor of my visit to the owner of the Shamrock." To be sure, it was not true. I regret to say that my wearing of the green that day was an accident. But what woman would not stretch a point with her conscience when a man was so tactful, so diplomatic, and so observant as to notice and speak about the color of her dress and ostrich plumes? With such an auspicious beginning, the interview could not help proving a success, especially as my genial host went on to explain how he had taken his 2 favorite thoroughbred Kentucky horses from the stable and sent them to meet his American visitor by way of paying a most especial compliment. He gave me tea of his own very best, and as we were about to drink it, he said, "Now, about that cup." Naturally, I thought he referred to the cup of tea I held in my hand, so I said, "Sir Thomas, it is yours. What more can I say?" "That is very kind, though almost unpatriotic of you, an American woman, to prophesy that I shall win the America Cup," returned Sir Thomas. Then I laughed, for it seemed we had been referring to 2 different cups altogether. But when the afternoon had passed, and the Kentucky horses were again brought out to take me to the station, we had another misunderstanding of the same sort. I had become great friends with Sir Thomas's little Pomeranian dog, which he had named Shamrock in honor of his boat, and the little dog was, of course, at the door when I took my leave. "Well, Sir Thomas," I said, "good-bye. May the best boat win, and may the best boat be—" I was springing into the carriage when I felt a tugging at my skirts and a gentle snapping at my heels. It was the sweet little Shamrock bidding me adieu, and I cried out, "Oh, Shamrock, Shamrock!" "That's right," shouted Sir Thomas as I drove away. "I knew you would wish me luck." And what did Sir Thomas Lipton do but afterwards tell a story of an American woman journalist who had interviewed him, and when she was going away said to him, "Good-bye, may the best boat win, and may the best boat be Shamrock." From gay to sad, from smiles to tears. This is the way of life, and this is the way of my reminiscences of some that I have interviewed. For only recently there came to me news of the death of the first person I interviewed after I came to London 9 years ago, the man who afterwards became my good friend, Sir Walter Besant. He was not Sir Walter then. I entered his office one day with all the self-confidence and assurance of the newly arrived American girl in London, and going up to him as he sat at his desk, I said, "I know you must be Mr. Besant. I just loved your Children of Gibeon. I'm an American, and I want to interview you on the subject of women's sphere, so I can put it in the paper." The kind-faced man rose, extended his hand in welcome, and laughed right heartily as he said, "I'm glad to see you, but you needed not to mention the fact of your being an American." Then I interviewed him and got his opinion of women's sphere, and was surprised to find him so very old-fashioned in his views of it. I earned £1 with that interview, and Mr. Besant wrote and complimented me. Another time I went to him. It was while my serial, describing my experience as a housemaid, was appearing in one of the London papers. He had written, telling me how glad he was that I had started out in that work. Most of the cities were treating me very kindly indeed, but that day I had seen a notice which I thought was unjust, not to say cruel. I carried it with me to Mr. Besant, and as I talked to him of the troubles of my career as a housemaid, I grew very tearful. Never mind," said he. "Why, you have started out on a great work. It will do you good, and all the working girls of London. You are going to do in real life what my heroines do in fiction. I shall take the greatest interest in watching what you do in London, for now you are one of my heroines." So kind, so good, so encouraging was he, that I went away with a greater determination to do my best than I had ever felt before, and the next day there came a note from him saying, "Don't get discouraged, but do your best, and read the next number of The Queen." So I read the next number of The Queen, and I found there a jolly, jingling little poem entitled The Lady Housemaid, by Walter Besant. The house and all about it, within it and without it, its manners and its residents we know. Lines of houses, miles and miles, from the ground floor to the tiles, how they live and how they carry on their show. But the mysteries begin, deep and dark and black as sin, when you ask about the cap and apron ranks. How they spend their busy days, what they think of fashion's ways. "Let me clear this mystery up," said Miss Banks. So an apron white she made, and a cap, for which she paid, and she humbly entered down the area stair. And behold a transformation, a fairy tale in variation, a housemaid meek and mild, once lady fair. On through several stanzas went the little poem, telling how she had a little book and observations took, and how now the lady housemaid was going to tell the world all about it, and receive the world's approval and its thanks. Was there ever a kindlier thing done by a busy author for the sake of encouraging a struggling young woman just entering on her career? And in the years that followed, when Mr. Besant had become Sir Walter, I went to him and wrote to him often, telling of my work, my successes, my failures, and received from him such kind words and letters of advice as helped me over many a rough place. "Are you very busy, Sir Walter?" I used to ask, when I went to his office to ask his advice, or tell him of things that happened in my career or the careers of others in which I thought he would take an interest. "Very, very busy," he would reply, smiling through his glasses, "but not too busy." The last time I saw him, a few months before his death, he told me how great was his interest in the Atlantic Union as a means of drawing together the United States and England. He explained how American and Canadian men of note, visiting England, were to be taken in hand when they arrived and be given a real good time, and shown all the sights by their English brothers. Be sure you give my Atlantic Union a puff whenever you can, in your letters over to the American papers, he said, in that same sort of simple, refreshing way that a young writer would ask for a newspaper notice. That was the very last thing he said to me, as I was going out of the door. It is a pleasant memory that he should, for what proved to be his farewell message to me, admonish me to do what I could towards cementing the friendship between my country and his. I am only one of the many belonging to the younger generation of writers who have much for which to thank Sir Walter Besant. He was the friend of all members of his craft, but most especially of beginners. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. About My Enemies and the Meanest Man I Ever Met. When I started out to write my memoirs, I took for my motto the advice which Mrs. Lynn Linton gave me a few years ago, on the occasion of my eventful interview with her. Guard against bitterness and cynicism. Have faith and hope and charity, especially charity. It has been my desire, in the main, to tell of pleasant happenings in my career, of kindnesses done to me, of helping hands held out, of struggles with difficulties finally overcome, of silver linings discovered to my clouds. It was only the other day that, on my remarking that I had nearly finished the writing of my autobiography, one of my editors said to me, "Ah, now I suppose we must look out for squalls. I suppose in this book you have written up all your enemies and are going to pay off old scores." "On the contrary," I replied, "I have been writing up my friends and letting my enemies alone. I love my friends and despise my enemies, and I wouldn't give the latter the satisfaction of thinking that they or their doings were important enough to be put into a book." I am just wondering now whether, having gone on this principle, and said little or nothing about people who have done me mean turns during my journalistic career, I may not have given my readers the impression that I have only been brought into contact with good-natured, kind, amiable persons, who have done their best to make things pleasant for me, that I have not known what it was to be harassed about with foes who talked about me, tried to pull me down when I have been trying to climb, laid snares and traps for me, and done their best to compass my downfall. It may be thought that, in short, I can always truthfully be singing, "Oh, everybody's awfully good to me." But this is entirely a misconception. Why, during my career at earning a livelihood, it has sometimes seemed to me that I have met more disagreeable, mean, wicked, and positively vicious people, to the square mile, than anybody else could possibly have met. The mean turns they have done me, and tried to do me, are without number. Enemies? Of course I have had, and probably still have, more of them than I could shake a stick at. But I do not consider it my business to go about chastising them. I let them chastise themselves, which I have noticed they generally seem bound to do in the end, and then I triumphantly exclaim with David, "He (or she) made a pit and digged it, and has fallen into the ditch which he (or she) made." This much, or rather this little, about my enemies. And now I will tell the story of the meanest man I ever met. I am sorry to say that the meanest man I ever met was an American, though I hasten to add that he was the meanest man not because, but in spite of his nationality. It is about 10 years since I made his acquaintance, and it happened in this wise. Just before I came to London, I was, as I have related in one of the earlier chapters of this book, employed as society editor on a prominent paper in one of our southern towns, and one day, wishing to take a run over to New York, I said to the Colonel, the managing editor, "I want to go to New York. May I use the passbook?" "Certainly," he replied, "but it will not pass you beyond Philadelphia, which is only halfway. You can go there and back on it, but from there to New York and from New York back again to Philadelphia you will have to pay." Inside the passbook the managing editor slipped a little note which read, "To the conductor. This certifies that Miss Elizabeth Banks is society editor of this paper, and is entitled to use this passbook between Philadelphia and this city either way." Now, if I had gone to New York contented with that, all would have been well with me. But, having got that help which stood for the remittance of half my railway fare, I determined, after the manner of Oliver Twist, to ask for more. So I wired on to a friendly politician in New York, saying, "Please send pass both ways, New York, Philadelphia." I felt sure I would get that pass, for I had once given that gentleman a write-up, and he had overwhelmed me with thanks, and had told me that whenever I wanted to travel on a particular railroad, I was to inform him so that he could send me a pass. The next morning came a letter from him. "I am only too glad to do this little service for you," he wrote. "I enclose the pass, which you will see is made out for my daughter, as I am not supposed to get passes for anybody except myself and the members of my own family. That, however, is all right. My daughter is about your age, and you can travel as my daughter." When I started on that journey, I used my passbook to Philadelphia. There, though I remained on the same train, a new conductor took charge because the train traveled to New York by a different road. I handed him my other pass, a paper on which was written, "Pass Miss Blankety Blank, New York to Philadelphia and return." That conductor took the paper, tore it along the perforated line, handed me back a part of it, and I put it in my purse for the return journey. On the last day of my stay in New York, I went shopping, and spent all the money I had except about $3. I saved that amount to pay my parlor car fee, for which no pass could ever be secured, and a late dinner on the train. The thought of arriving home penniless did not trouble me, for my week's salary would be due and waiting for me at the cashier's desk when I got back. "Ticket, please," said the conductor, when I was seated in the train for the return journey. "Pass," I said mechanically, handing him the slip of paper which the conductor on the outgoing journey had returned to me when he took up my pass. "This is no pass. It's a coupon torn off a pass," said the conductor when he had examined it. I was astonished, but as soon as he handed it back to me for examination, I saw that he spoke the truth. It was just such a voucher as one leaves in a checkbook after tearing out a check. It had on it a number and the duplicate words, "Pass Miss Blankety Blank, New York to Philadelphia and return," but no signature, no official stamp. I saw what had happened. My pass had said, "New York to Philadelphia and return," when it should have been made out the other way, "Philadelphia to New York and return." In going to New York, the conductor had taken it for granted that I was returning there from Philadelphia, had kept my pass and given me back the voucher, which was nothing but a receipt for it. I explained all this to the conductor on the homeward journey. "That may be true," he answered, "but that does not alter the fact that you will have to pay me the fare from New York to Philadelphia." Pay the fare! Great heavens! I had only 90 cents, for I had already paid for my Pullman seat and for my dinner. "I can't pay the fare," I answered. "I haven't got it." "Then I'll have to put you off the train at the next depot." Now, the next depot was little more than a log cabin in the wilderness. A pretty plight, indeed, for me to be turned off there at night, and in the thunderstorm which was raging. If I could only get to Philadelphia, I knew I would be safe, for a new conductor would be on the train. I would give him my proper newspaper passbook, and I would be myself again. This, however, I could not admit to the present conductor, for to do so would be to confess that I had been traveling to Philadelphia under false pretenses. The trouble this would cause me would be slight compared with what would ensue for my friend Senator Blankety Blank, who had given me a pass made out for his daughter. "I wish you would let me go on to Philadelphia," I said persuasively to the conductor. "I have friends there with whom I could stop overnight while I telegraphed home for money." "Can't do that," he replied, "but I'll tell you what I can do. I will telegraph to your father if you will give me his address." My father! It suddenly occurred to me that the conductor was referring to the eminent Senator Blankety Blank. "He's not in New York," I answered. "He is on the road to Chicago, so you could not reach him. Let me think a minute. Let me think." "You'll have just 20 minutes to think in, Miss Blank," replied the conductor sneeringly. "And then off the train at the next depot you go." "You seem to be in trouble. Can I assist you in any way?" I heard a voice saying as the conductor moved down the corridor. I knew it must be the voice of the man who sat in the chair opposite me, for we two were the only occupants of the car. My heart leaped for joy as I looked into his face. Here was my deliverer! I would give him my card and tell him my story, and he would laugh after the manner of a gallant American knight rescuing an American maiden in distress. I liked his face. It seemed kind and benevolent, though in his dress and manner he looked a veritable man of the world. "Have you heard the conversation between me and the conductor?" I asked. "Yes," he answered. "You can render me great assistance," I returned. "But, if I accept it, I must take you into my confidence, and tell you the whole truth, which I dare not tell the conductor. May I confide in you?" "Most certainly you may," he replied. Thereupon I told him everything, how I was not Miss Blankety Blank at all, but only myself. I gave him my proper card, and showed him my newspaper passbook and my editor's letter of identification. "Have you no money at all?" he asked. 90 cents, I said, laughing. "The fare to Philadelphia is $2.85, is it not?" he asked. "And I take it you would like to borrow $1.95? I answered that this was the fact, though I wondered how I was to get home from the station when I arrived at the end of my journey. "Very well, I am able to make you this loan, of which you seem to stand greatly in need. But you are a stranger to me, and how do I know I shall ever get it back again? A few minutes ago you were passing yourself off as the daughter of Senator Blank. Now you show me papers that would go to prove you to be some other person. How do I know you are that person either, instead of an adventuress trying to get a railway journey for nothing?" He looked serious enough, but I judged he was one of our dry American humorists, and I laughed. There was, however, no answering laugh, and I was puzzled. "I will lend you the $1.95 if you can give me collateral, something of equal value, which I can keep in case you cheat me." "I cheat you!" I exclaimed angrily. "Have I not shown you a letter testifying that I hold a responsible position on a prominent paper? My salary awaits me in the office, and you will receive your $1.95 tomorrow by registered letter." "Excuse me, but as I said before, you have been traveling in a dishonest manner, and I am not willing to trust you without collateral. I notice that you have a ring on your finger. I am willing to take that as collateral, and give you a receipt for it. It will, I presume, cover the amount of your indebtedness to me." My ring worth $1.95! My ring, with its diamonds surrounding a turquoise! Dared I pawn it for my fare to Philadelphia? "You say you do not know, but I am intending to cheat you," I said. "May I remind you that this ring is worth a goodly sum of money, and ask how I am to know you are not a highwayman trying to rob me?" "Here is my card," he replied, handing me a pasteboard. "I am quite indifferent as to whether you accept my offer or refuse it. If you do not accept it, you will be put off at the next depot, and if you do accept, it must be on the terms I have mentioned. I never lend money to anyone without security." My brain was in a whirl, and I was getting frightened. "I accept your offer," I answered. "Please give me a receipt for it and the money to pay my fare. I will send you the money as soon as I arrive home, and I suppose I shall have my ring back at once." "Certainly," he replied, handing me a pencil-written receipt and the money. Then I paid the conductor. At Philadelphia the man with my ring got out. The old conductor also left the train, and to the new one I gave my passbook, which took me on. From the station to the office I walked through the pouring rain, and found the editors and reporters still at work. To them I told the story of my return trip, and how I had pawned my ring for $1.95 to a man of whom I had never before heard, a man who had given me in return a pencil receipt written on the back of a card which gave a name and an address in Philadelphia. At first my confrères laughed, but suddenly they grew serious. They supplied me with the money that was needed, but declared that I had better keep it, for I had no doubt been made the victim of a swindler. We got the money off to Philadelphia that morning, and I waited 2 days for my ring. The ring I valued, not because of its monetary worth, but because of its associations, and when the second day passed I became a fit subject for a lunatic asylum. On the third day I sent 4 telegrams after it, and numerous members of the staff offered to go to Philadelphia to try to trace it and the swindler. But when they considered that it must become publicly known that I had traveled as somebody else, and that the eminent politician must be placed in a predicament, that plan was abandoned. On the morning of the 4th day my ring arrived, and with it a letter which read as follows: "Madame, the heading of the paper on which I write will show you the responsible position I hold as superintendent of the Sunday School, and a worker among the poor and the erring ones of this great town, as well as the business firm of which I am the head. The principle which governs all my actions is that of trying to do good and teach lessons of righteousness. I took your ring, and have kept you waiting thus long for it, in order to give you a lifelong lesson never to travel under false pretenses again. I knew who you were from the moment I saw you, even before you had your trouble with the conductor, having seen you at a reception in your city, and had you pointed out to me by a friend. I knew, of course, you would send me back the money you borrowed, but I took your ring to make you worry, and so punish you for the sin you committed by traveling with a pass made out for another person. I hope the lesson will not be without good results, and an effect on your future life and career. Yours very truly, blank." I could, if I would, give the name of a man well known in the city of Philadelphia as the writer of the above letter, but I am not too cruel, and I content myself by putting him in this book as the meanest man I ever met. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Looking Backward and Forward. As I come to the final chapter of my reminiscences, which take in a journalistic career of something over a decade, I find there is a tendency to retrospection, a looking backward. Again I see myself as I stood in the door of the proprietor's office in that newspaper building out west, asking the white-haired man who sat at the desk, "Do you own the paper?" Again I hear him say, "A newspaper girl, a newspaper girl, don't think of it. Be anything, but don't be a newspaper girl." Yet I did think of it. I became a newspaper girl, and I am not sorry. Still, I can appreciate the kindly motive of the wise old man in thus warning me off the threshold. He peered into the future, He saw the struggles, the hard tasks to be performed, the tears, the tragedies, the plucking at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the learning somewhat of the mysteries of life, the sins, the sadnesses which must come into my experience, once I had started on the way, so in pity he said to me, "Go back to the grocer and tell him you made a mistake when you said you were going to be a newspaper girl." Then, as I was not to be turned back, he took me on and gave me my start. A better start, a kinder start, a more helpful start, it has often seemed to me, than falls to the lot of many girls who begin the life journalistic. However, I do not think it can be said, by those who read this description of the part of my career through which I have already passed, that my experience has been an altogether easy one, or that whatever of the beginnings of success I have already attained has been the result of luck rather than of hard work. I speak of the beginnings of success, for that is all I yet can claim. I am far from the point in my career where it could be truly said of me that I had arrived in the proper sense of the term, though in one way I have arrived at the parting of the ways. Up to the present time I have always been engaged in writing about facts, when I have longed to try my hand at something in the way of fiction. My editors and the public have constantly demanded of me that I should go out and make things happen. They have kept saying to me, "Write about yourself, write about yourself." So, up to the present, I have been engaged mostly in writing about myself, and have perforce been my own heroine, till finally I decided to write this, my journalistic autobiography, down to date, and tell all about myself in one book at one writing. And hereafter it is my intention to begin to "make up things," and write stories with other heroines than myself, and heroes too. Most writers would, I suppose, have waited till the far-off future before telling the story of their lives and their experiences to the public. Then they would have written a book of memoirs that would extend over a much longer period than do these, my reminiscences, which I publish while I am a struggling, working woman journalist, to help to keep the pot a-boiling while I press towards the prize of the mark of my high calling. For it is a high calling. Shame to those journalists who write to aspirants who would enter a journalistic career, "If you have enough money to buy a broom with which to sweep a crossing, then become a crossing sweeper rather than a journalist." Who has not read this sort of advice from men, and some women too, who themselves are successful journalists, yet who try to belittle their profession by speaking thus meanly of it? No, it is not better to be a crossing sweeper than to be a journalist. I, perhaps, can speak more authoritatively in this matter than can most persons, for I have been a crossing sweeper as well as a journalist. To any young woman who asks me whether she shall enter upon a journalistic career, I say, yes, if you are ready. I do not say that you should come by all means, under every circumstance. I say, come if you are ready. The yoke is not always easy, the burden is not always light, but neither are they so in any other profession. If you are ready to work and ready to live, why not become a journalist? Not more ignorant of the world and of life, not more tremblingly fearful, not more hopeful than was I at the beginning, can you be now, so let not your heart be too much troubled at the outset. Come and learn better than you can in any other profession open to our sex, what life, great, wide, teeming life, out in the world of men and women, is like. It will do you good. You belong perhaps to the guild of the sorrowing. Something of sadness has already come to you, and you think your heart will break unless you can work and forget. Come out with me then, and look upon the sorrows of your sister women, you who hug your little tragedy to your breast, as though no woman but you ever had a tragedy. Look you, see how others suffer and yet live, yet smile, and talk no more of your breaking heart. Why, in this workaday world, Hearts do not break, they sting and ache. Nor is that all. Not only into haunts of the sorrowful must you go. You must also enter into some of the haunts of sin, and even this will not harm you. It will do you good. It will but teach you charity. It will show you how much are we all the creatures of circumstance. You will learn that you might have been as others, had the circumstances, the temptations, the trials, the hereditary influences which surround those others confronted you. Your work may take you to talk through prison bars to men and women condemned, perhaps, to death for murder, or to years of servitude for forgery, robbery, and it will not hurt you to talk with them, to learn something of their former lives. As I have said, it will do you good, for it will strengthen your character while making your heart more tender. Shall you enter upon the journalistic career? Yes, if you are ready. Why not? Ah, there is a knock at my door. Though I have written a sign upon it, "Keep off the grass," by which everyone is supposed to understand that I am engaged in writing the last chapter of my autobiography, and am not to be disturbed, the house parlour maid walks in and says, "Miss, the man has brought the gas bill. He says if it is not paid by Friday—" I could not finish this chapter until after I had stopped, right in the midst of it, to hurry off a pot boiler to bring in the price of gas consumed. As I have already said, I have not yet arrived, and therefore I must still call myself a writer of pot boilers. One of the pleasant things to contemplate just at this stage of my career is the fact that I have got to the point where I can rattle off a pot boiler very quickly, and I generally have a pretty good idea of where to send it to ensure its acceptance. That I count as one of my greatest blessings, one of the encouraging aspects of my present position. I look forward to a time when I shall not have to write pot boilers, and need not be disturbed when I am finishing up a book by such commonplace, unromantic, and altogether inartistic announcements as that with which the house parlour maid just broke in upon my work. However, there are far worse things in life than to be obliged to write pot boilers. A very much more worrying thing would be not to know what to do with them when they were written, and to have them returned with editorial regrets after they were sent out. My hard-up editor tells me that the pot boilers I send him are among the best contributions to English literature, and that he looks forward with dread to the time when I shall have become so prosperous that I need not write any more of them. The house parlour maid has disturbed me again. She has brought a long, large envelope, the sort in which I send out my contributions, and the sort also which I enclose, stamped and self-addressed, for their return if unsuitable. It has an American 15-cent stamp on it. It is a magazine article returned from my native land, and here is the editorial note that is enclosed with it. "This thing won't do, that is, in its present British shape. Lend me your ears, my countrywoman, while I tell you that my circulation is entirely among Americans who want good hot stuff. I don't exactly want you to twist the lion's tail, but I do want you, as an American woman over there right on the spot, to pitch into 'em. Try those pages over again where you see I have put the words 'too tame.' Give it to John Bull, for he's all wrong there, and it will do him good to be shown what's what. And, by the way, I send you by this mail an American spelling book, the kind you and I used to study when we went to the district school. Kindly refresh your spelling apparatus with it, and note that 'favor' is not spelt with a U in it, and please correct various other of your English spelt words, for I will not have our compositors losing their wits over what they call 'furrin tongues' whenever they have anything of yours to set up. And why in the world have you got into that abominable English habit of writing 'I fancy'? I guess you mean that you think, and why don't you say so? Don't go to losing your Americanism over there, and for heaven's sake hang on to your accent if you've got any left. Remember you are a citizen of the United States Empire, and don't go to losing any of the visible signs and symbols to that effect which you have been wont to carry about you. And hurry up and rewrite those Anglomaniac paragraphs, and send back your stuff by the next mail. I put my head on my typewriter and laugh as I finish the reading of this characteristic epistle from my countryman. Then I note his postscript, "Enclosed find encourager." The encourager is a check for $60. After all, I really do find myself singing, "Oh, everybody's awfully good to me." That is, I mean, almost everybody, in the shape of editors and such. Did I not get another article back this morning from one of my favorite English editors? Yes, and this is what he wrote. "I consider this article the best thing you ever submitted to me. Nevertheless, I want you to write it all over. By rewriting it, I feel sure you will note several things you can greatly improve without my telling you what those things are. I have a feeling that you have hurried it just a little, probably because you have that autobiography of yours on hand, and as I wish this to be of your very best, I am taking the liberty of putting you to this trouble. I do this as your friend, not as your editor, for, were I but a hard-hearted editor, I should run it into my next number, which I very much desired to do, even though I knew it did not do you justice. Do not rush it, but take your time over it. And may I suggest that you make some of the passages a little less American in their point of view?" So here I am, with 2 articles returned, not rejected, but to be rewritten. My American editor wants good hot stuff written more from the American point of view, pitching into the British, and hurried up to be sent by the next mail. Well, he shall have it. How can I take his encouragers and not give him what he considers their value? And besides, the British do need pitching into upon certain subjects. My English editor wants my article to be of my very best from a literary point of view, and I expect I was a little too spread-eagle-like in certain of my paragraphs. He shall have what he wants too. I will take my time over it, and revise and polish until it shines and shines, and perhaps after a while I shall become what they call a stylist. And here, brought up to my study, for company to tea, in a flannel-lined, straw-upholstered basket, is a black mother cat with 5 coal-black kittens. I call them my lucky literary kittens. They were born in my waste-paper basket in my study. Their mother was a stray. That is, I found her sitting on the front step one afternoon, and I invited her to come in. That was several months ago, and one morning she repaid me for my hospitality by introducing me to her 5 black kittens as I was sitting down at my desk and happened to look into the waste-paper basket. I have great ambitions for these kittens. As they were born into a journalistic atmosphere, I wish them to continue to live in that atmosphere all their lives, so I am trying to dispose of them among various London newspapers as office cats. I have called upon and written to several editors in their behalf, and, as soon as they are old enough to leave their mother, I have no doubt I shall have them all well placed. 3 are already bespoke, and although one of my editors yesterday declined one with thanks when I offered it to him along with a manuscript, he has very kindly written a story about them, in which he has called upon his contemporaries to come to the rescue and take them off my hands. They are really lucky kittens to me personally, for I have just got a check for a story I wrote about them and their mother, which I have entitled The Luck of the Black Cat. Meanwhile, I have the kittens on my hands for several weeks, and very glad I am of their company. Now they jump out onto the floor, joyous, full of life and spirit. They perform wonderful feats at boxing and tail chasing, and sometimes they climb up to my desk and upset the ink bottle, and create havoc among my papers. How could one be utterly cast down, or remain long in a fit of the blues, with 5 kittens having such a glorious time of it, blinking their little blue eyes in mischief, opening them wide with wonder and curiosity. "Where's Judge?" "Judge, Judge!" I cry out. "Where are you, Judge? Ah, here you are, trotting over to my desk, putting your beautiful, silky black head into my lap, looking up at me with your love-lit eyes. How could I think for one instant that you would fail to be here, close by me, my dearest, sweetest, most faithful friend, when I add the last touch to these memoirs of ours? How shall we send them, Judge? Happily? Well, let's try, for happy endings are much desired. People want to feel glad, not sad, in the remembrance of a book. But our difficulty is that we have been treating of facts, not fiction. If it were a story we had made up, we would now pull the strings and bring all our puppets together in the last chapter, give apples and peanuts to the good ones, make the bad ones fall over a precipice, and good riddance to them. But we haven't any puppets in this book. We've been writing only about real people and real dogs, and we can't pull the strings and bring them all together and deal with them according to their deserts. Some of them came into our life and went out of it just like ships that pass in the night and speak each other in passing. Then out on the ocean of life they went, toward what distant shore we know not. Ah, would we not call some of them back, Judge, if we could? For instance, now, would we not like to have our dear old Dinah back with us? You prick up your ears at her name, don't you? She was one of our very greatest friends, wasn't she? But even she had to pass on, after speaking to us for a little while. She thinks she's doing right, poor old Dinah, taking in washing and ironing and going to camp meetings, and, as she writes us, getting ready to go to Hebben by and by. Just you and I together, Judge, left here to tell our story as far as it has gone. I, the heroine, you, the hero. In most books they somehow manage that the hero and the heroine shall be left together at the end, living happily ever after. Shall we not manage that too, Judge, you and I? What's that you're saying, with those speaking eyes of yours? Getting to be an old dog now. 13 years old last birthday? Why, Judge, what of that? You make me laugh through my tears, as I stroke your dear head, and note the gray that mingles with the black about your ears. Listen, sweet Judge, you and I are not of those who dare to measure the love and power of our Creator in such a way that we'd make him the God only of the two-legged. No, indeed. You and I are going to live happily together ever after. End of chapter 28. End of The Autobiography of a Newspaper Girl by Elizabeth L. Banks. Recording by Tricia G. Thanks for listening.